What is your best? It's a small world story. Left the US to travel Europe when I was young. Stayed for a while on a small island in Greece. Eventually ran into my neighbor, literally the girl next door. We both couldn't believe it. Ended up having a great night catching up. Eventually lost her to this suave Italian guy. Can't really blame her. You don't go to Europe to fuck your neighbors, but she... Okay. I was in Okinawa, Japan when I decided to stop off at a video store run by an American expat. I was wearing a shirt featuring the name of an extremely small high school I'd attended in upstate New York. Think 200 students, village of 600 people. Expat, are you from village? Me, yeah, I graduated from school a few years ago. Expat, so did I. I was class of 1969 me. That's the year my mother graduated. Did you know mom? Expat, yeah, we dated for a little bit. I used to work for your grandmother until I joined the Marines. Moral of the story, there's no escaping the small town. Ever. Repost that got buried last time. My grandpa, who knew my granny when they were children, told me about how he'd cycle for hours to see her, and she'd get her friend/next-door neighbor to hang out with him instead. Then when they got too close, Granny realized what she was missing out on and chased her friend off, reclaiming him. They were together for another 70 years or so. Anyway, I told this story to one of my best friends, whom I met at university, nowhere near where either of our families came from, mentioning the name of this other woman. There was an incredulous pause, and then she says, "But that's my grandma. You've met her." After confirming a few details, we realized she was the right woman, and talked to her and found she still remembered songs my grandpa had sung to her. We exchanged details for our grandmothers, and they chatted on the phone for the first time in decades, both in their late 80s. TLDR university housemate, and I discovered our grandmothers were best friends in childhood. My mom is from Melbourne, Australia. My dad is from the west coast of Ireland. A few years ago, my mom decided to look into her ancestry, since she knew her relatives were from Ireland. Turns out her family 8 generations ago, before they moved to Australia, were neighbors of my father's family, who have lived in the same place for the last 8 generations. It really is a small world, even when it seemed infinitely large that long ago. Tongue sticking out. My grandfather is that super kind, talkative guy that makes friends with every person he meets. He visited Italy with my grandmother, and while walking down the street heard someone calling, "Joe, Joe." Turns out it was someone he had met back home in NJ that just so happened to be vacationing in Italy as well, and was able to pick him out of a crowd. Was at Disney World with my sister and brother-in-law. We started chatting with the couple next to us in line. Turns out the woman is from the same town that me and my sister grew up in. We'd never met or seen her before. And the man was from the same town that my brother-in-law grew up in. The real kicker is we grew up in New England, and my brother-in-law is from a small town in Australia. What are the odds of 2 pairs of unrelated people from opposite sides of the world getting married and ending up standing next to each other at Disney World? I can start. Went to Brazil on charter holiday. Met this guy in the pool. Turns out he is from my hometown and had met my father a week earlier when my father transported him in an ambulance. 6 months later, I met this guy's stepdaughter on a nightclub in my hometown. Went on skiing vacation with my parents to a location 1,000 kilometers from my hometown. Met an old girlfriend on a nightclub that I had not seen for many, many years. Had a one-night stand, including breakfast with my parents. Edit, I almost forgot. I was working in a call center with IT support for a couple of months in another part of the country. A guy calls on behalf of his company, ordering new parts for computers. At the end of the call, when he stated his name, I realized it was my next cousin calling. He did not know that I was working there. Went to the cemetery to visit my grandfather for the first time since the funeral. We couldn't find a grave marker, so we went to the office to ask where he is. When we told the woman in the office his name, she said she knew someone who spelt their name the same way. It turns out he was a security guard for a company. She was the receptionist at 60 years ago. She thought he was cute. When I was a freshman in high school, we were doing the typical icebreaker, everyone giving their fun fact. One guy says that when he was preschool age, he lived in Singapore due to his dad's job. Another kid says, "Wait, me too." Turns out 10 years later, 2 preschool best friends living with their expatriate parents ended up in the same math class in suburban Philadelphia. My sister mentioned her friend said that her mom's company was hiring for a job. I have 10 years experience within a state 1,000 miles away from me. I applied, sent the friend's mom my resume, and waited for reply. She replied that she sent my resume onto the hiring manager. She then asked if I remember the hiring manager. We graduated college from the same school, with the same major, in the same organization, and at the same time. I have an interview on Monday. I've posted this before, but here goes. A girl I went to school with moved to Singapore from Scotland. I hadn't seen her for a few years since she moved. A couple of years later, my mate moved from Scotland to Perth, Australia, and I was going over for a few weeks to visit. So I fly from Glasgow to Dubai and then on to Perth. There I am waiting in immigration in Perth, and I bump into the girl who moved to Singapore. I go outside and meet my mate who was waiting on me, and he was speaking to her too. They were in class together back in Scotland. Me and my mom live in Canada, moved from Germany. I was born their mom born in Russia. We went for vacation to Mexico 3 years ago. We saw an ad about swimming with dolphins, and me and her went like, fuck yeah, we are doing that. We get to the place, change into our swim gear, and buy the tickets for the event, and walk the narrow walkway towards the pool with the dolphin. This woman coming from the pool walks towards us and passes us. My mom suddenly recognized her and screams, Natalia. Woman turns around and screams my mom's name. So it turns out we just met my mom's best friend from elementary school in Russia. Natalia randomly moved away when my mom was a child and lost contact completely. We ended up not going to the pool for like half an hour because they had to catch up on life stories and exchange contact info. TL, Dr. Mom met long-lost childhood friend at a dolphin swimming place in Mexico. My dad was walking in the mountains around where I live. After a few hours out there, he finds a wallet on the ground, looks inside to see the ID. The owner of the wallet turns out to be a dude my dad worked with about 20 years ago. Anyways, he carries on walking, not thinking much of it other than an interesting coincidence. After a couple of hours walking, he hears a Land Rover 4x4 driving on the mountain. The Land Rover pulls up next to my dad, and who should be the driver but the owner of the wallet my dad had picked up a few hours ago. The guy he'd worked with 20 years ago, hadn't seen him in almost as long. So dad hands over the wallet to the bemusement of his old friend who wasn't up there looking for it, and had lost it up there over 6 months previously. What are the chances, One of my best friends is someone I met on Halo 3. We met online through some mutual friend, and we eventually started to play together all the time. After at least a year of playing with each other, I heard him say Oakbrook, which is a neighborhood a few miles from where I live, and I had a lot of friends who lived there, so I was very familiar with the place. I asked him if it was the same Oakbrook that I knew, and sure enough it was. Later that week I drove to his place, and thus our friendship began. Short version, WoW was in its peak at the time, around 12 million players, had a long-term guildmate and friend on WoW. Went to a music festival and hung out with a bunch of strangers who camped next to us. About a month after the festival, I started talking to my guild mate about my time at the festival. He recognized particular details about my story. Turns out he was one of the guys I was drinking with. We met up the next year, and sure enough, it was him. When I was about 11, I went on a cruise where I made a friend, Curtis. We never spoke after that, but we were friends on FB. Then when 16, I traveled to an away football match where I saw him in the away crowd leaving the ground after the game. Was so strange. The next year, when I was 17, I was watching festival highlights on YouTube when he was in the middle of a song shown on the TV footage. I was walking my poodle in Forest Park in Portland, Oregon, when I met another poodle owner. In the course of our rambling conversation, I asked the woman where she had gotten her poodle. Oh, you wouldn't know her. She lives way up off in northern New Hampshire. The woman said, I know Charlene, was my immediate reply, and I was right. I was at a party at Charlene's house a couple years earlier. We won the prize for longest trip, and I had met the parents of the dog now in front of me. So I grew up in Ohio and moved to Texas for a job. In order to make friends, I joined a meetup group. At one of the events, a girl mentions how she was going back to Ohio to visit her family. So I ask her where. She mentions a big city. So I say I grew up in one of its suburbs. Well, she was from that same suburb. Did you go to school, X? Yes, I did. She asked me if I knew so-and-so. He was my best friend. Then we found out I had played piano at her wedding when she married my best friend's brother, who she then later divorced. So it was a little awkward after we figured it all out. Just after coming out of the ride with that damn song still echoing in my head, we ran into Goofy and Mickey at the exact same time. I almost never see two characters together in the park, but there they were. So my sister got a great picture with both Goofy and Mickey. It was a pretty great day. In my gap year, I worked in a large library in the UK with a woman who wore incredibly stinky and unpleasant hippie perfume. I would smell her about 2 minutes before I saw her appear, at which point she would say, "Oh, hello," in a really vague and dreamy hippie voice. 5 years later, I had moved abroad to a small city in France. I smelled her about 2 minutes before I saw her appearing one day, thinking to myself, surely not. It can't be. And suddenly there she was saying, "Oh, bonjour," in a really vague and dreamy hippie voice with a terrible French accent. Not a life-changing coincidence, but it has always made me smile. My family and I went to the Rainforest Cafe near Disney World in Orlando, Florida, and by total coincidence, ran into my uncle with his family at the same restaurant. As my family was waiting to be seated, my mom saw my uncle talking to the hostess and said, "Wow, that guy looks like my brother. Holy shit." We lived about an hour and a half from Orlando, and my uncle lived about 4 or 5 hours away. Honeymoon was at Disney World. We walked to Epcot the first night, and my husband remembered to tell me that a co-worker was there to propose to his girlfriend. But the likelihood of us seeing him was low. As he finished those words, we hear, "Hey," and there they were. Hadn't proposed yet. We chatted and carried on. Later that week, we went to a restaurant reservation early, and they seated us next to them. We ended up getting drinks on the boardwalk. Fun times. She said yes. During the school year, our English teacher brought some lovely Californian ladies from a nearby school. They were studying abroad for a few weeks. For us to speak with were French. We had a blast, invited them to the bar afterwards, and it was a great night for all parties involved. And 6 months later, while I'm in London with my family for the vacations, I see someone I think I know. I ask, "Sage?" She turns, and she was the American girl I'd talked the most with on vacation here with her family too, and she happened to be in the same exact Londonian street the exact same day. So yeah, I guess it's a small world. I left Albuquerque, New Mexico for Jerusalem, as in Israel, needed an apartment, and was worried that my Hebrew was not going to be good enough to negotiate. Found a listing at my college and checked it out. I knew the landlord. She'd lived in Albuquerque for many years. I rented from here and spent a fabulous year in the old city of Jerusalem. From the roof deck, we could see the Dome of the Rock and the Herva Arch since rebuilt. Amazing year. I've got two. Met a family in France, and turned out we not only lived in the same city, but the same road back home. Made friends with a guy in China. Then one day I was drinking at a friend's house back in the UK, and someone knocked on the window. Turns out it was the guy from China who now studies at the same uni as me and saw me through the window as he was walking back home to the flat next door. I was at a TV show taping in Los Angeles and struck up conversation with a man next to me in line. Skipping how we arrived at it, we ultimately learned that we both grew up in the same city 3,000 miles away, on the same street, 2 houses apart. Our 15-year age difference is why we never knew each other at the time. When I was in high school, I went to see a local band play a free event. I was 15. Now 23, I met a guy not too long ago that I instantly sort of connected with and spent a lot of time talking about his music. Turns out, he was the same guitarist I'd seen at that local show 8 years ago. In an even weirder twist of fate, I've now got a degree in music and am teaching a music theory. My buddy and I are hanging out, and he tells me we're getting his friend and his friend's girlfriend. So, we pull up, and his friend ended up being someone I knew. His girlfriend was someone I knew through something else. He sits down, we start talking about some work I had done, and he asks where I got it done. I drop the name of a local businessman, an all-around nice dude who's known my family for years. He mentions that his family's known the guy for years. I spin around to keep talking to him, and he's wearing a sweatshirt from the fucking place. And if it had a zipper, it would have been the exact sweatshirt that I'm wearing as I type this. Was in Air Force basic training in 2009. Was within the first 2 weeks of training. Our brother flight's TI was in our dorm assisting with inspections. Let's call him SGDT. As they're going from bunk to bunk, SGDT is asking everybody where they are from and eventually gets to me. He asks, I answer, I'm from Delaware. He replies, I'm from Delaware. What part? I answer the town I'm from, and of course he says, I'm from town name. At this point, it's already crazy enough that we are from the same state. He continues on to ask, where in town name? And I reply with the neighborhood. Lo, and behold, he is from the exact same neighborhood. Turns out his wife and daughter lived less than a quarter mile behind me. In case anyone is wondering, his wife is also AF and was stationed at the local military installation. SGDT was on his 3rd tour of being a TI and just travels to San Antonio to push flights, then goes back home in between. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.